Wow. Okay. Looks like we're okay.
Where's everyone?
Check 1, 2.
Hello? 7:05. Where's everyone?
Okay.
Hello? Hello?
It says we're streaming, so.
Did we do it, Frank?
Wow.
What?
Hi, Frank.
I'm here. Woke up from a nap
Been
just.
in Maryland, Illinois?
Yeah, well, Illinois is.
I can't hear.
If you're speaking to us, Frank, we can't hear you.
Oh.
Is his microphone on?
Oh, you know what? I
It
think
might be on our end.
it's probably on my end. Can you try talking now, Frank?
Can I try talking now, Frank? Did you hear me? Hello?
His mouth
Am I
is
here?
moving.
Hello?
Trying to yell back up.
Yeah.
Hello?
I'm going to exit the meeting real quick and get right back in. So just a second, Frank.
Okay.
Welcome to LifeBridge. So let's try again, Frank.
I'm here.
Are you playing with us? No.
It's still not working.
I'm talking.
No.
Back up.
How about that? Try that one.
Try that now. Hello.
It's still not working.
Testing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, no more.
I know what's happening. I don't
LifeBridge
know how to
mic
fix
is
it.
off.
Is what's my problem is. Okay, I'm going to log out and get back in again. Hang on.
Technology more trouble than it's worth.
Different things fighting for
Times.
Does Ron have his...
Spent a full day with them today. Went to
Trouble
the
than it's
stores.
worth. Times.
Thank you. What you been doing with all your spare time?
I'm here. I don't know where they are, but I'm here.
You got a little tracker on your wrist there? Track your steps? Yeah.
Okay, can you hear us, Frank?
I can hear you now. Yes.
And we can't hear you.
My mic is working.
Would it help at all if I connected my computer to the owl and let you do the...
Unfortunately, what's happening is it's not. It says it's sending it to the meeting owl, but it's not.
Okay, have you hit the setting, oh, that's your computer setting, have you done the settings in the owl?
You know what?
Have you done the settings from there? The ... in settings.
Yeah, what that should be after,
Meeting out, communications.
Stadium, it's connecting downstairs.
Right.
Okay, Frank, can you talk to us?
Yes, I can. I can
Hey,
talk. I can talk for a long time.
Tracy figured it out.
I can talk. Yes, I can.
We're back. We're back up and running.
Comma.
have you tested it right when you wake up in the morning?
The
Resting heart rate.
little icon in the top right-hand corner of the LifeBridge worship icon.
You want me to look at something, Frank?
No, he's texting by talking, and his microphone's on, so we can hear him now.
Talking.
'Cause you fixed it.
Talking.
Okay. Well, I started the recording a little a little bit ago,
My microphone is working.
and so
Comma.
I apologize.
LifeBridge worship microphone is not on.
Who are you texting? Can you hear us? Oh, okay. All right. Well, let's get started, and I'll have to remove 10 minutes of technical getting ready off of the stream from later. But let's pray. Father, as we come together this evening and start into a new mini-series of Wednesday evenings for Dive Deep, we pray, Lord, that you'll use this time to not only fill our minds and strengthen our knowledge of you through your creation, but we ask you, Lord, to strengthen our faith. Use this to help us to have a quiet confidence in you as the creator of the heavens and the earth, and use it for our conversations that we have with people who do not see you as the creator of the heavens and the earth. Fill our discussion tonight with truth and with grace. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. So we've been going into a lot of different kind of general categories of things with the Dive Deep series. We spent some time talking about world religions and looking at things kind of historically to help us to understand where they came from and how they developed. We've now spent some time talking about different Christian denominations and how they developed. When we talked about world religions, we talked about it from the perspective of helping us to feel equipped to talk to somebody who's coming from one of those different world religion perspectives and be able to help them to perhaps see Christ in a different way, see Jesus in a different way. Interestingly enough, by the way, we have a Confucius Center right down here that's tied to the university, to Valparaiso University. And I've been reading a series of articles that have been letting me know that they're actually going to get closed down. They had funding and support from Valparaiso University for their kind of multicultural aspect of the university. And it is apparently going to get in the way of their government funding. And because of that, they're going to be closing it down, I think, as of March is the last that I saw. So it's going to stay there through March, and then Valparaiso University is going to close it down or disconnect from them, which essentially will close it down because they won't have any funding anymore to keep it going. But, as we talked about Confucianism, it is right here, literally in our backyard. It's right down the street. But anyway, we talked about world religions, then we moved on to Christian denominations. And when we talked about Christian denominations, it was really from the standpoint of building unity. How can we reach across those denominational lines? And as we finished up on 2 Wednesdays ago, before we had rest stop last week, we talked about the church that we are a part of, Life Bridge Christian Church, and the movement that it came out of, which is a movement of people that were tired of all the arguing and the bickering and the condemning each other to hell and drawing lines in the sand and saying that, we have the right brand of Christianity, but they have the wrong brand of Christianity. And there were some key folks that really came out of that in the 1800s that said, we're done with this. They left their Presbyterian backgrounds, they left their Baptist backgrounds, they left all their different denominational backgrounds, and they said, we're going to pick up the Bible, we're going to do our best to understand it, to follow it, and it is going to be our sole guide for faith and practice. And so that biblical authority, as well as a desire to be in unity with all other Christ followers, all other Christians, is really what drove that movement. And we now have millions of people in churches all across the United States and really around the world that are a part of churches just like this. They don't want to be called a denomination. The whole point was to shed the things that are the distinctives, the things that get in the way of us having unity in Christ. And we said we want to grow in our relationship with God and our relationship with each other. And so biblical authority, Christian unity, that's the driver, not just of Life Bridge Christian Church, but of Christian churches, churches of Christ, all around Valparaiso, Porter County, across Chicagoland, across the United States, and around the world. And that's where we ended up 2 weeks ago. Last week we had a rest stop, and now we're picking up with a new series of things that we're going to be diving into with rest stop or with dive deep. And you might be asking yourself, why, Pete, are you getting into things like dating systems? This week it's going to be specifically radiocarbon dating. Well, what I'd like to do is to hold off answering that question until at the end of our time together, and I'll share really my motivation for teaching these. This entire month, actually, is going to be focused on dating systems. How do we know how old an object is? And so we have different styles, different types, and as we dive into that, I want to remind myself and us what it is that we're doing this for, and that is to draw closer to God and to understand God's creation better, and to be able to talk with people that perhaps don't have a faith in God. And so to kind of keep that God focus to start with, I give us a scripture before we dive into the science side of things. And the scripture I chose today is from the book of Job. When Job was finally getting to the point where he was ready to talk back to God, and when he started to talk back to God, it says, the Lord God spoke to Job out of the storm. He came and God spoke back to Job. And he said to Job, who is it that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Embrace yourself like a man, because I'm going to question you, and it's going to be your turn to answer me. you've been asking me a bunch of questions. Now I'm going to start asking you. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off the dimensions? I mean, surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were the footings set? Who laid the cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. Who shut up the sea behind its doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garments and wrapped it in thick darkness? When I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place? When I said, "This far you may come and no farther. Here is where your proud waves will halt."
And those are some of the minus he did.
Yeah. Those were just a couple of the details of creation in the creation account.
That's exactly what is in Scripture.
Yes. Yeah. So the thing that I guess I want us to see and keep in mind is that when we get into dating systems, the reason we're getting into dating systems is, at least from a scientific standpoint, is the conflict or the battle between two different scientific approaches, which I've already talked about in a dive deep on the week, where I pointed out that the most common belief system in our area is the belief system of none. I do not believe in any God. I am not affiliated with any church. 6 in 10 people in Porter County fall into that category when they are asked the question. And so the question of origins, where did we come from, always ends up coming up and challenging somebody that doesn't believe in any kind of a God, any kind of a deity. And that has been answered in the more recent years, in the last 150, 200 years, okay, by scientists coming up with, first we have evolution, which was originated by Charles Darwin, and we also then added into it the Big Bang Theory, which is the idea that matter has always existed and it was highly compressed and then there was an explosion. Okay. Now, when you dive into those two theories and where they came from, what you find is that Charles Darwin, when he floated his theory out there to begin with, it was from a combination of things. First of all, he had observations on the Galapagos Islands of the finches and changes and variations of the different kinds. But he also had problems really with God and church and religion at the time. And so while he credited God as creating everything, what you see is kind of an evolution to his theory of evolution, where he started to say, well, we see these changes in animals. Maybe those changes could have taken place and gone across different species or different groups of animals, not just within a group. And so he started looking for that. He started looking for that specifically in the fossil records. He started looking, because to say that they made changes that went from one group to another, he started looking for it in animals that were alive in his day, and nothing was happening fast enough. It wasn't like a cow didn't give birth to a horse. He didn't see significant changes in one generation as he started to approach things scientifically. And so he went back to the fossil records and said, well, maybe we'll find it in the fossil records. Problem is that he didn't find it in the fossil records either. There was no evidence whatsoever in the fossil records of changes where they went from one kind of animal to another kind of an animal. And so because of that, and he wanted to float the theory out there and have other scientists start to get into it, what he did is, as he wrote Origin of the Species, he brought up the fact that he can't find anything in the fossil records. He said in his book that if his theory were true, that we should find many, many, many examples, hundreds of examples, thousands of examples in the fossil records. And so part of the reason for writing the book and putting it out there for the scientific community was so that other people would start looking for this stuff to see if, in fact, it could be true. But as he went on, he also put in the book the possibility, because by this point he had done some searching and couldn't find anything in the fossil records. He said, first of all, the fossil records are spotty at best. And when you get into what creates a fossil, you start to understand why. You really have to have a set of circumstances that kind of preserve the bones of the animal rather than erode it away or destroy it, because the bones will get destroyed in a rather short period of time unless something happens to fossilize them and capture them. And so we don't have, tons and tons of fossils. Is a great thing when we find them and we can study them. But the other thing is that he said, perhaps his theory is not false, but his theory is true, and it is true because the timeline is much larger than we thought it was. Maybe the earth wasn't created thousands of years ago. Maybe it came about or was created millions or billions of years ago. And if you give ourselves that much time, that much of a timeline, then it starts to introduce enough time for small incremental changes to have happened over a really long period of time, and perhaps his theory could be true. So he introduced the idea of millions or billions of years rather than thousands of years for when things came about. For the last couple hundred years, 150 plus years, scientists have then been taking that theory and trying to go out and see if, in fact, his theory could be true and things could be millions and billions of years old rather than thousands of years old. Now, this creates in the world and in the scientific community a divide immediately in terms of what it is they're trying to take the data and roll it up into. You have scientists that are trying to see, can this thing be millions or billions of years old? And you have other scientists that are strong Judeo-Christian biblicists that are saying, can it be thousands of years old? Because not only are they strong Judeo-Christian biblicists, but they are taking a very specific interpretation of the different passages that talk about creation. And so you have what are called young earth creationists or young earth scientists. And you have old earth scientists. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up, and the reason we're going to be getting into this over the next several weeks, is that our kids are growing up in a world that is where they are being told that Big Bang and evolution is science and creation is religion. There was a famous trial, got nicknamed the Scopes monkey trial, where this was put on trial, and the results of that trial was that exactly what I said, that young earth and creation is faith or religion, and old earth and evolution and the Big Bang Theory is the result of scientific endeavor. And from that point on, in our public schools, that is the way it is taught. In fact, the religion part is removed from the picture, and the Big Bang, evolution, old earth, old universe is taught as science. Here's my problem with it. I love science. Okay, I do. I love science. For as long as I can remember, I love taking things apart and seeing how they tick and how they work and putting it back together again and seeing if I can get it to work again, or if it's broken, figuring out why it's broken, how to fix it. I liked exploring the world around me and seeing how it works and interacts with each other. I like the scientific method. Okay. If you're not familiar with the scientific method simply starts out with a hypothesis, an educated guess about something and how it works. And then what we do is we test the hypotheses by running experiments, okay? And we see if the data matches with the hypothesis or not. If it matches, then maybe it gets elevated to a theory instead of just an educated guess, because now I have some data to back it up. If it doesn't match, then we adjust the educated guess, the hypothesis, and go back and try it again. And if you get things that are repeatable over and over again as you test and experiment, then it gets elevated to a theory. If, in fact, every time it comes back and it matches the hypothesis, the educated guess, the theory, it can become what they call a scientific law, because it matches so consistently every time it gets tested. This is the way science works. And science can be a beautiful way of exploring God's creation and learning more about the mind of our Creator. And yet what we're doing is telling our children that's not science. If you're looking at God, if you're looking at the world around us as being created by God, then you're not doing a scientific endeavor. You're doing a religious endeavor. You are exploring your faith, and that's fine and that's valid, but just not in the classroom. See, but these two things were not always at odds with each other. And in fact, you can take the scientific method and apply it to the world around us, and it can still end up with information that is matching up with what we get from the pages of Scripture. Radiocarbon dating, though, and other dating methods seem to fly in the face of that, because you will read articles, you will see stuff on the internet, you will listen to videos, you can go into classes, and the teachers will teach consistently. You can go to Natural History Museum, you can turn on the History Channel. The teachers will teach consistently that the universe is billions of years old and that evolution has been taking place over millions and millions of years. And what they use for their primary dating method, at least with part of the picture, is what's called radiocarbon dating. So, what I wanted to do tonight is to explore that dating method with you and give you some scientific understanding of what scientists are doing and help you to see that what they're doing actually does not go against our faith in a creator God. In fact, it doesn't go against the possibility of the world being thousands of years old rather than billions and billions of years old. And you're like, well, Pete, if they're scientists and they're running all these, the scientific tests, how is it that can possibly be? Well, let's start by understanding what radiocarbon dating is and what it is that they are doing when they try to date an object using radiocarbon dating. So I'm going to try to present my whiteboard here and see if my orange triangles are better on the other side. It's working. I think we're okay. Okay. Much of a living creature, actually much of our universe, is made up of an element on our periodic tables called carbon. Okay, and I don't know how much you guys remember from your periodic table of elements, but carbon is one of the elements that's on there, and each element that is on the periodic table has a number that's associated with it. The number is referring to the number of protons that element has. We have three pieces of an atom that we have. Do you guys remember what the three things were? Yeah, protons, neutrons, and electrons. Exactly. And if you remember from our science class, you've got protons carry a charge that is a positive charge, and electrons carry a charge that is a negative charge, and neutrons don't have any charge whatsoever. Okay? And the way it works, at least we think, we haven't really seen an atom. We still can't get down to that level, okay? But the theory would state that there's kind of like a core of protons and neutrons, okay? And then the electrons are kind of doing this around the outside. And so a normal sort of stable element will have the same number of protons as there are neutrons in that core. And if you recall, we end up building molecules by swapping electrons, and so you kind of end up with things that will join up, and electrons will fly off and come back in, and we'll end up with, so you take hydrogen and you take oxygen and you put 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen, you have H2O, and all of a sudden you have water, okay? And so you take these atoms and you kind of connect them, and the electrons, we don't know how they do their whatever around the outside, but all of a sudden we have a molecule of water by bringing together those three things. Much of the world around us, much of our body, is made up of an element called carbon. Okay, and carbon has, I think, a 6. Is that correct? I'm going to make sure I've got this right. Its atomic, yeah, its atomic number is a 6, and its atomic weight is a 12. Okay, and what that means is the atomic weight comes from the number of protons and the number of neutrons together. So there's 6 protons and there's 6 neutrons, and that's a total of 12, and so that's atomic weight of 12. In our world right now today, there are carbon atoms that have been changed, as a result of rays, like from the sun, affecting them. And they have more neutrons than they're supposed to. It's a very small percentage of them, but there are some what they call carbon-13 instead of having the atomic weight of 12. And what that means is that they have an extra neutron that's in there. And those carbon atoms are a little bit more unstable than the ones that have a nice 6 and 6, where it's all balanced out. There's another one that is a carbon-14. And the carbon-14 has 2 extra neutrons, and so that gives it an atomic weight of 14. And it is an element that is very unstable. In fact, the word they'll use for it is that it is radioactive. Okay, and a carbon-14, and this exists again in the world, in the universe around us, and the carbon-14 atom doesn't want to stay as a 14. It wants to become a 12. Okay? So the extra neutrons that are in there, it wants to get rid of. It wants to let go of. So what scientists have done is they've studied this element, and they have determined several things about this element. First of all, that it ends up in the plants through photosynthesis, and then animals eat the plants, and this carbon-14 ends up in the animals. In other words, you and I, right now today, have carbon-14 in our systems. All the animals do, all of the plants do, all living organisms have carbon-14 in them, inside of them. And this helps us to understand what radiocarbon dating is going to be doing. Radiocarbon dating cannot be used on any object that you want. Radiocarbon dating can only be used on living creatures that have died, or living organisms that have died. A plant that has died, or an animal or a person that has died. Because all of us absorb this carbon-14 by eating food. We absorb it by, the plants absorb it through the soil and through the photosynthesis process and so forth. And so they have it, and we have it. And here's what scientists found out. That when someone dies, when an animal dies, a person dies, what happens is that the carbon-14 that is inside of them, or a part of them, starts to do its radioactive deterioration thing. It doesn't want to be a 14, it wants to be a 12. And so what happens is it starts to release, get rid of those extra neutrons that it has, and releases them into another atom somehow. And it does it at a really, really, really slow rate. Okay. In fact, it does it at a very predictable slow rate. I didn't write it on there. Okay. So the slow rate at which it deteriorates is measured in what's called a half-life. Okay. The way a half-life works is it says that a number of carbon-14 atoms that exist when something dies If I drop down to 50% of those carbon-14 atoms, okay, where I measure, and there are now half of the carbon-14 atoms that were there when that creature was alive, then the amount of time that it takes to get down to 50% is called the half-life. So in the case of a carbon-14 atom, it's 5,700 years. So if an animal dies and it has this many carbon-14 atoms in it, after 5,700 years, it will be at 50% of the carbon-14 atoms left in that bone of or fossil of that particular animal. You guys with me so far? What a half-life does is it just keeps cutting things in half. So what it's saying is, if we go out another 5,700 years, so we're up to 11,400 years after the animal died, it will be down to 25%. Because it will cut this 50% in half. So the dot will come out to here. You go another 5,700 years, so we're going to be up to, I got to do that math in my head, right? 117,100 years. We're going to cut it in half again. So we're going to be down to 12.5% of the original number of carbon-14 atoms. And that object will be 17,100 years. Mathematically, this is, they got a name for this kind of curve. It's called a parabola. And what happens is that that line will keep getting closer and closer and closer and closer and closer to zero, but it'll never quite get there. And that makes it perfect for measuring things that are really, 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 really old, see? Because what you can do is you can measure how many carbon-14 atoms it has left, and compared to its starting point, and all you got to do is put it here and then draw your dotted line and get to your curve, and it says that object or that animal died that many years ago. See how that works? So we create a curve using C14 with a 5,700 year half-life. And all we got to do is measure how many carbon-14 atoms this particular bone has, and that animal died that many years ago. Because while we're breathing and while we're eating, what we do is we keep the same number of carbon-14 atoms in our system. We keep ingesting it. We keep an equilibrium of it while we are here and while we are living. But when we die, we stop breathing, we stop eating, we stop doing all those things. So our bone marrow that's inside of us stops processing, and it just starts breaking down at a rate of 50% every 5,700 years. It's measurable. You can put a meter on it, and away you go. Which makes it great for measuring millions and billions of years. Yes. But we're talking science, not religion today. Earthly sanctification. Keep approaching it, but never quite there. All right. So this is the method. This is the approach. This is what scientists are doing when they're telling you the age of an object using carbon-14. Now, like any other scientific method and testing method, there are challenges and there are assumptions that go along with it. And what I want you to see today are both the challenges and the assumptions that go into this particular dating method. So I want to explain a little bit. The first thing that I want you to see is that the first challenge is how small of a quantity of the world has, or the low saturation, the low level of saturation of carbon-14, the low percentage of carbon-14 in the world around us. That's the first challenge, okay? I've got it on your paper. Small amounts of C14. The element carbon occurs in nature in three isotopic forms. Carbon-12, which is the stable one, is 98.9% of the carbon that we find when we measure the world around us. The rest, 1.1%, is mostly made up of carbon-13, which has one extra neutron, not two. Okay? And carbon-13 is actually stable enough that we can't measure any degradation that happens with it. It just seems to stay. It doesn't break down. Even though it's kind of lopsided and awkward, it's at least stable enough that we can't seem to see it breaking down or changing form. Carbon-14, though, the one that is unstable or radioactive, is in our atmosphere in only about 1 out of every 1 trillion carbon atoms. So 1 out of every 1 trillion is carbon-14. Okay? So what that means is you're talking about even this starting point right here at the top of the curve is a tiny, 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 tiny number. Really, really small. And then we're going to subtract from it to keep going down from there. How do we overcome a challenge like that? Well, I figured rather than trying to describe it, I would instead give you all a video. And so for those of you who are on the OWL, like Frank, hopefully you'll be able to watch this video and hear it and see it. For those of you who are watching on the stream, what I'll do is I'll break up this video into two, and then I'll give you a link to go to so that you can watch the video. Because the video is actually from Griffith University in Queensland, Australia. And the reason I chose this one is this is the premier, it is the official Radiocarbon Dating Institute for all of Australia. And so these are the experts that are doing this. So I'm going to go ahead and share this video. And Frank, I'm going to turn off my microphone so that we don't get feedback when I play it, and hopefully you'll hear sound. And yeah, go ahead and unmute now. And let's give this a try.
For this segment, I'd like to introduce Dr. Stuart Fallon, who is the head of the Radiocarbon Dating Laboratory at the Australian National University.
The first step is to drill the bone and collect the powder. We then do tests that verify the bone is suitable for dating. So in the chemistry laboratory, we dissolve the bone with a dilute acid so we can isolate the collagen. The collagen is the organic protein in bone that is the most robust and most suitable for radiocarbon dating. So the next step is we take the cleaned collagen sample and we freeze dry it to remove all of the water from the sample. After freeze drying, we end up with nice, pure, clean, fluffy collagen. The next step is we have to convert the collagen to carbon dioxide. And to do this, we weigh out 2 milligrams of collagen and we load it into a quartz tube. Inside the quartz tube, we add copper oxide and silver. Copper oxide provides oxygen to generate the carbon dioxide. Now we load the sample on a vacuum line, where we evacuate all of the air out of the quartz tube. We then use a flame torch to seal the tube with our pure collagen sample inside. We next put the samples into the oven at 900 degrees for 6 hours. This is to make CO2 inside the quartz tubes. The first step is to load the quartz tube onto the vacuum line. We evacuate or remove all of the air from around the tube, and then we crack the sample. We isolate the carbon dioxide using liquid nitrogen, which is cold enough to freeze carbon dioxide into a solid. We transfer the carbon dioxide into an individual reactor. We then add hydrogen to the carbon dioxide. We heat it at 560 degrees, and after 2 hours, the carbon dioxide has turned into elemental carbon or graphite. We then take the graphite and we press it into our small aluminum sample holders. Now we will load the samples into the accelerator mass spectrometer. Our sample wheel holds 39 samples. Inside we have a mixture of standards, secondary standards, blank samples, and our unknown samples. Let me show you how the accelerator mass spectrometer works. Our graphite samples are inside our ion source. In the ion source, we heat up cesium, which is a metal. The positive cesium ions interact with the graphite and generate negative carbon ions. These ions are accelerated to 44,000 volts. The ions are then separated in a magnetic field or a mass spectrometer, where we can separate out carbon 12, carbon 13, and carbon 14. The ions and molecules, which are also in the beam, are further accelerated to 245,000 volts. The ions and molecules then go through a cloud of helium gas, where all the molecules are broken up. The beam then goes through another magnetic field, or the second mass spectrometer in the accelerator mass spectrometer, where we can measure carbon 12 and carbon 13. Carbon 14 is further filtered by an energy filter, and we measure each carbon 14 atom as it hits a silicon detector.
All right. Okay.
Right, making the universe.
I tell you what, that's a lot of work, isn't it? And an awful lot of steps in that process. And because of that, it ends up feeling like it's very valid, right? I mean, if they're going through all of that just to isolate, notice at the end of the process, to isolate and count the number of carbon-14 atoms. That's what that entire process is about, is to isolate and count the carbon-14 atoms. Everything about that process adds legitimacy to it and saying, well, that is scientific. That's science. That they're doing the science of determining how old that object is. But what they're actually doing is they are doing the science of determining how many carbon-14 atoms are in that sample. Now, you might be going, well, wait a minute. Isn't that exactly what you just said? It's telling us how old the object is. No, that's not what it's doing. They're doing all of that work to get an accurate accounting of how many carbon-14 atoms exist in that sample. The reason they do all that work is because they end up with all kinds of problems with samples being what they call contaminated. And what that means is that it has carbon-14 atoms in there that didn't come from that animal or from that bone. See? And so the result is that the number is bigger and the object looks younger when they try to apply it to this curve of radiocarbon dating. And so they add another step to the process, and then they add another step to the process, and they keep adding steps to the process to try to make sure that they're not picking up carbon-14 atoms from things that were buried around it or from here today. They know that it's wrong because sometimes they'll come back with a number that is like now or bigger than now, because they've got an extra batch of these carbon-14 atoms that are in there, and it's even more than what is generally in the atmosphere. So they do all that work to remove any what they call contamination to the field, contamination to the sample, to the object, and to make sure that the number that they're getting here, the number of carbon-14 atoms, is the number of carbon-14 atoms that were inside that bone, or inside that bone. Because what they're trying to find out is, when did that animal die? And they're assuming that it started with this many carbon-14 atoms, and we need to get an accurate point, an accurate number of how many, so that we can go across and we can figure out off of our curve how old the object is. You guys with me? All of that work is trying to get an accurate data point. That's what it's about. Because the assumption is that if I get an accurate data point, that data point will tell me how old that object is. But here's another challenge. Okay? The other challenge is that we don't know how many carbon-14 atoms were in the atmosphere before we started measuring how many carbon-14 atoms were in the atmosphere. This graph assumes, if we say, there's, 10,000 carbon-14 atoms in a, liter. Pick some volume that we measured, okay? Because today, that's how many carbon-14 atoms we find when we measure this much volume today. Well, do we know that that number, 10,000, is a constant?
Like saying for like a given, any given object, that the 10,000 is a volume that we will say and assume is in every bone. Is that what you're just
Right. Because that is what is in the atmosphere today. That is what is, it gets, we can measure plants, we can measure people, we can measure, your skin and so forth. And
We have a bad echo now to this machine. I don't know, same thing with your computer.
there's an echo
On YouTube.
on the YouTube. Turn off the tracks and see if that works. Just leave my microphone on. Okay, so the carbon-14 today it remains in what we call equilibrium. So it's in the sky, it's in us, it's in plants. And so you measure a plant, you measure a live person, you get a sample from a live person, you get a sample from the air, and you're going to get roughly the same amount of, same percentage, the same number of carbon-14 atoms in all of those places. Okay? And we know that the rate of decay is got a half-life of 5,700 years. Did that fix it? Okay. We know that the rate of decay is 5,700 years, half-life. And so because of that, we know the starting point, we know the rate of decay, and we can build our curve. So that when we get a measurement of 5,000 instead of 10,000, we know that's 50%, and that object is 5,700 years. You're with me so far? Okay, so this is all making sense. One of the challenges, though, like I said, is that we can end up, we're dealing with such small amounts that contamination is real easy. There's another challenge, and the challenge is that we're making an assumption that this starting point here has always been this number. Whatever is in the atmosphere today is always what has been in the atmosphere. Because if it was, if 10 years ago the number was 20,000, then the starting point's different. Okay? And now I measure and I get a 12,000 and I say, well, I must have a contaminated sample because it's saying 12,000. And so that's bigger than what's in the atmosphere today, so it can't be right. Well, not necessarily. Maybe it was 20,000 100 years ago. And so 12,000 is actually showing a degradation of 8,000, but you don't know because you don't know what the starting point is. In other words, this curve is working off of a fixed point, a fixed starting point, and if that starting point isn't fixed, then you're trying to hit a moving target. This curve is doing this, depending on what was in the atmosphere at the time that the animal died. See, because when the animal died, whatever was in the atmosphere, that was the equilibrium. That's the starting point of that object's curve.
Is that applicable to rocks? The amount of these?
Well, it doesn't work with rocks because they're not ingesting it. They're not taking it into their system. So it only works, this is only, the equilibrium part has to do with it's in the atmosphere and then living creatures. I call them creatures. Evolutionary scientists wouldn't call them creatures, but living beings. There we go. So because we breathe, because we eat, because they photosynthesize and they're in. Then what happens is it comes out of the atmosphere, goes into the plants, comes out of the plants and goes into us. And so we maintain an equilibrium. We match what's in the atmosphere, the amount of carbon-14. When we die, then we're not eating anymore, and it starts breaking down. That's the whole idea behind this particular dating method. But if the starting point in the atmosphere changes, then this curve becomes useless, because we don't know if the number's 10,000 when they died, or if the number was 20,000 when they died, or the number was 3,000 when they died. And all of a sudden, it starts to break down from the starting point when they died, and we don't know what's in the atmosphere. Scientists have tried to deal with that. At the bottom of page 1, the moving starting point. The next question, of course, is how do we know the amount of C14 that was in the living tissue when it died? Well, unfortunately, this isn't simple to determine. As it turns out, the production of C14 in the atmosphere has not been constant over time. So scientists know for sure that this point right here is not a fixed point. The starting point is not a starting point that we can know for sure. Okay? We've been able to confirm this by measuring tree rings and comparing their known age with the radiocarbon results. So what they do is they took a tree, slice it, it was living until they sliced it, so it just now dies. It has in it these carbon-14 atoms, and what they do is they count the tree rings to determine how old the tree is, and then they measure the number of carbon-14 atoms at each tree ring, and what happens is that they start to get an idea of how much carbon-14 was there as the starting point for the curve. Okay? That making sense? So this curve isn't at a fixed number. Your curve is going up and down based upon the amount of carbon-14 at the moment that object died. And they're trying to figure it out by a live tree, because it has different levels of carbon-14 all the way going in the different rings of the tree ring. So we know that this ring, this sample, is 100 years old, and we scrape that, do everything that you just saw there, and hope that you didn't get it from another ring before it or another ring after it, okay, to get a data point for the top of the curve. Okay? This allows us to create carbon calibration curves, but our ring chronology only goes back 12,000 years. Okay? So what does that mean? That means that we've come up with a way to adjust this thing up and down over the last 12,000 years. So if an object comes back with a rating or a lifespan that is more than 12,000 years ago using this curve, we're guessing. Because the curve, we know, over the last 12,000 years does this. Okay? And so it introduces a much larger amount of error when we go past the tree ring calibration. You with me so far? When we calculate the age using radiocarbon dating, then there are 3 key assumptions that are being made with that scientific method, even with all of that hard work that they're doing to make sure that they're getting a clean sample and they're measuring the number of atoms correctly, okay, there are still 3 key assumptions to this dating method. The first is that you got a clean sample, okay, and we've already talked about that. It's such a small amount of carbon-14 compared to all of the other carbon that even the tiniest miscalculation, bad sample, something else in that sample other than the marrow of the bone of that animal, anything that can screw that up. And so we do all of the process that you saw there to try to get it as clean as possible. So they're doing things like they're sealing that tube, right, with it, and making sure that no other elements can be in there. Because if you don't seal that, you can end up with the carbon-14 from the atmosphere getting into your sample.
Break the tube within a sealed container as well.
Inside a sealed container as well. Everything that they're doing is trying to eliminate contamination of the field, is what they call it. So a clean sample is the first assumption, that we got it right. And what scientists will do oftentimes is they will eliminate that themselves. They end up doing a lot of comparisons and, wait a minute, this number is way out of range. It must be a contaminated sample. Okay. Until they come back with something that is closer to what they expect. The second thing that we're assuming is the starting point in terms of the amount of carbon-14 that was in the atmosphere when that animal died. All right? And we were already figured out that we can't assume that that starting point is the same as it is today. It has changed over time. We know that from cutting the tree and taking samples all along the rings. And so we have a calibration curve of the starting point. So if we have something that's coming back with a number here and it's going to come out way out here, what we do is we try to calibrate it with we use this starting point to go with that measurement. Makes the math a lot more complicated than a simple curve, but we're doing it. Okay. But there is a third assumption that we haven't talked about yet. And when you listen to scientists refer to carbon-14, they will say immediately that it has a 5,700-year half-life and that it never, ever changes. I watched several videos, I read several articles, and that is something that they will hold on to. That the half-life of the carbon-14 atom is 5,700 years. Unless you ask a scientist how they came up with that half-life, someone who is actually honest about the science behind coming up with this curve in the first place. I have an example here of a good, clean, honest answer to the question, how did we come up with the half-life curve? Bless you. How did we come up with the half-life curve of carbon-14? How do we know it hits 50% after 5,700 years, it hits 25% after 11,400 years? How do we know that? How have we measured that scientifically? The level of radioactive carbon, his answer says, was measured in organisms that had just died. It's a very small value, and multiple experiments were done to measure the levels, and the results were averaged. So that's our starting point here. Okay. So he's talking about in general, that's how we came up with the starting point here. He doesn't get into the calibration curve that I just talked about. The level of radioactive carbon is assumed to be equal to the level of radioactive carbon in the atmosphere, which is assumed to have remained constant throughout the history of the Earth. It's an assumption that we know to be wrong, but it's necessary in order to build this curve. So right off the bat, we know that this number is not constant, but we need it in order to have a starting point for our curve. And so we just pick the number that exists today, and that's how we start the curve. That's what he's telling you. The samples were then measured after a period of time to find the new levels of radioactivity. The loss of radioactivity was then extrapolated backwards to find the half-life. What's he saying? What he's saying is that we saw an animal die, okay? And we measured the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere at the time. And then we waited a year. And we went in and we scraped the marrow and did that whole process that you saw. And we measured the amount of carbon-14 in the marrow after 1 year. And we saw how much it went down. Now remember, carbon-14 is 1 out of every 1 in a trillion carbon atoms is carbon-14. We're already starting a really small number, okay? And we measured how much it dropped after a year. Maybe we did that after 2 years and after 3 years, okay? And what we did then is we got a data point, and we got a data point, and we got a data point after 3 years. Right? And then we did a mathematical thing called extrapolation. All right. I go through and I do a bunch of scientific experiments, all right? And I measure, I'm measuring 2 things, you know, whatever the X is and whatever the Y is. So I'm measuring one thing here and I'm measuring another thing here. You know, pick whatever the 2 things are that you're measuring. And it does this. My data comes back. I plot the points of the measurements and it comes back like this, all right? What we do in mathematics is we take that information and we feed it into a formula which allows us to actually, or we take the information and we actually turn it into a formula that creates what they call an approximation. It creates maybe a line or a curve that best matches these individual data points. If the line goes through like this, okay, the points down here and the points up here create what is called a margin of error, or a plus or minus margin of error. And what happens then is that if you get a data point like over here or over here or over here, if you want to guess what this value will be, even though it's between 2 actual data points that I measured, what I'll do is I want to guess what the value will be for this. I come up here to the line that is generated by my formula, and I say it's probably this. Even though I have a data point on this side of it and a data point on this side of it, it's probably going to end up being somewhere around here with a plus or minus margin of error. Now, with the kind of data that I have right here, it's like, well, they're all about the same, Pete. They're just kind of going horizontally. So no matter what this measurement is, it's always going to be about the same. It looks like it's a straight line, and it's like that. Okay. So let's look at it a little different. Let's make it so that my data points are doing this. Okay? So I do the same thing and I draw my line. And I've got a measurement here that doesn't match any of the particular data points, and I get this measurement, and I guess that this measurement would be this based upon the line. So I take the data, I turn it into a formula, create a line, and that allows me to estimate something. As long as I am inside of the things that I've already measured in interpolation. It's called interpolation. So you're using the line to guess a value, and it's inside of data that the measurements that you've already made. Okay? It's within those. So it's called interpolation. When I go outside of my measured data, X is outside of, it's called extrapolation. So I get a measurement out here, and I want to know what it's going to be over on my my other axes. I come up, I hit this line, and I say it would probably be here. This will be the value over here. But it is outside of anything that I have measured before. It is further out than anything that I've measured before. And so we know mathematically, scientifically, it becomes much greater margin of error. Because I can't measure the margin of error. It's not inside of the data that I've already done. Okay. Why does this matter? Because I just told you that the way we came up with this curve was we measured stuff over 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years. I'll give them 5 years. You know what? Let's give them 100 years. Okay? They haven't been doing these tests for 100 years, but I'll give them 100 years. And we got a bunch of these little data points, and we measured the rate at which the decay took place. How many carbon-14 atoms disappeared and became carbon-13 or carbon-12? Okay, so that you only have this many carbon-14 left. How many of them reacted so that they are no longer carbon-14? And we have data for this teeny tiny little piece here. And then we extrapolated the curve to do this. Now he goes on and he says, now the results were then tested and refined by measuring the levels of radioactive carbon in the samples of organic material from archaeological sites of known ages. And we're going to get into this when we talk about archaeological dating systems, and we're going to have a week on that. Okay, but essentially, we've got this dig. We find all this stuff, and it has a clay tablet with a writing on it that refers to a king, and we know when that king was because we have another clay tablet or we have another papyrus or something that tells us when that king lived. Okay? And so what we do is we take this object, maybe this bone, because they had, something for dinner, okay? And we take the bone from this archaeological dig that is somehow tied to something that has writing on it that tells us what date it was or how old it was. And we slap our meter on there. See, we go through and we get that sample and we do all the stuff that you saw on the video, and we come back with a number. See? And then we take that number and we put it into our data, not because we measured it ourselves. See? It's not because we watched when the animal died, measured the amount in the atmosphere, and then measured it again a year later, and measured it again 5 years later, and measured it again 10 years later. It's because now we found this object, we get a reading off of a bone from that dig. We assume that the bone is from the same time period and didn't get, some dog didn't dig a hole and put that bone in there 100 years later. So we assume that it's from the same time period. We slap our meter on it, we get a reading, and then we come back and we put it into our calculations for creating this line or this curve. All right? Notice what he says. The levels of radioactive material in a house built in 1200 AD could be determined and compared to the extrapolated experimental curve. The assumption is that the wood used in the house was close to the known age of the construction of the house, and it leaves a plus or minus value to the age for the determination of the wood. So now we can go back 1,000 years, maybe 2,000 years, maybe even 3,000 years. Okay, well, Moses, wait a minute. Moses was 3,500 BC. Let's go back 3,500 years. Abraham, 4,000 years. Well, let's go back to 4,000 years. Okay. So now, I've got data I got a couple of data points, right, that are going back as far as maybe 4,000 years old. And then we go up here, I got a whole bunch of data points here, right, that's showing that it's fallen off. Now here's the problem. These data points are filled with assumptions that can mess with them one way or another. These data points have less assumptions. I have more of these. I have very few of these. Okay? And as a guy with a degree in mathematics, I can tell you that I can take all of these data points and I can create a curve that looks like the one that they have. I can also take those data points with a similar margin of error and create a curve that looks more like this. I can take those same data points with a very similar margin of error and create a curve that looks like that. And I can take those data points with a similar margin of error and create a curve that looks like that. Well, Pete, why do you care? Why does that matter? Well, remember what radiocarbon dating is doing. It's measuring the number of carbon-14 atoms, coming down here on the XY axis, taking that measurement, plotting it, and going over to the curve to find out how old the object is. And if I come down here and I have a measurement that's way down here, just a couple of atoms, and I'm using this curve right here, what it just told me is that that object is 10,000 years old. If I use this curve right here, it tells me that it's 12,000 years old. If I use this curve right here, it tells me that it's 15,000 years old. And if I use this curve here, it tells me that it's 30,000 years old. And the thing is that now I'm measuring all the way down here, teeny tiny numbers of atoms. And when I get that teeny tiny number of atoms back, and I use the curve that assumes a 5,700 year half-life, that tells me, if I follow that curve, that that object is millions of years old. But if I use a curve that is just as valid, it'll tell me that that object is 10,000 years old. Why am I spending time talking about science and radiocarbon dating? Back in Cincinnati, Tracy and I were teaching a Sunday school class for 5th grade boys. We walked in prepared for our lesson about Jesus and Bible, and 2 of the boys were arguing with each other as we walked into the classroom. One of the boys is actually the son of a Bible college professor, one of my teachers and mentors, and that boy is now grown up. He has his PhD in chemistry. That boy was saying that God created the heavens and the earth. Good Bible college professor's kid, right? So you would expect that. There was another boy that was arguing, no, scientists have proven that we're here from Big Bang and evolution. There is no creator God. They're going back and forth and they're arguing with each other. At which point I took the lesson plan and set it aside, and I went over to the chalkboard, because back then whiteboards were called chalkboards. And I told the guys, I said, you know what? I'm glad to hear you talking about science, because I love science. In fact, I am trained in science. I have a degree in mathematics and a degree in computer science. And if I hadn't been growing up in a time where computers were really just right on the cutting edge of everything, I probably would have gone into some kind of physics, kind of science, because I love learning how the universe works. And I started talking to him about the scientific method. I love the scientific method. And I said, you guys know what the scientific method is? 5th grade boys, been going to school. They knew their scientific method. They told me, I said, start out with what? They said, hypothesis. Okay, so we tell them about hypothesis. What do you do with a hypothesis? Well, you test it, okay? And so when I test the hypothesis with an experiment, then what does it turn into? A theory. Well, I knew what a theory was, okay? And if we keep testing that theory and it comes back, then what does it turn into? A scientific law. That's right, it turns into a scientific law. The whole time I'm thinking in my head, when am I going to be smarter than a 5th grader? Because, these guys were answering all the questions and keeping up with me all the way through. And what I did is I got to the point where I started to talk about carbon-14, and I was kind of doing the 5th grade version, and this was more advanced than the 5th grade version tonight, okay? But I was doing the 5th grade version of this, and talking about how it degrades, and you have a carbon isotope and so forth, and it breaks down, and it's at a measurable rate. And I said, and we build this curve with these data points. And so you do data points up here, and when you measure it, and then you can put a curve that's through it. And when you are putting a line or a curve inside of the things that you have measured, it's called interpolation. And the kid who is the staunch scientist, Big Bang evolutionist, said, it's called what? And I thought, yes. I know something that a fifth grader doesn't. Okay, we're good. And then I also talked to him about extrapolation. And then I did this picture that I just did right here. Okay? And I explained that, we measure the number of carbon-14 and we get a measurement. It's way down here. Teeny tiny measurement inside of a teeny tiny starting point. And we do this, and what happens is that I get this measurement and I go out to my curve and it tells me how old something is. And if I do that and I go out to the curve that the scientific community uses, then we've got billions of years old. But if I use this curve, it's millions of years old. And if I do this one, it's thousands of years old. And I do this one, it's less than 10,000 years, which is what matches the Bible. And I got to that point, and I finished making that point, and somebody said, it's time to go to kids' church. Line up at the door, because that's what you do, Go to your Sunday school class, and then you went to kids' church. Kids all got up. They lined up at the door, except for Jay. He just sat there staring at the chalkboard. Come on, Jay, time to line up. Let's go. Time for kids' church. Just stared at the chalkboard. His world was shaken. 2 weeks later, Tracy and I were sitting in the church service, and we had the privilege of seeing Jay walk down the aisle and go forward and accept Jesus as his Savior. He got baptized that day. This is what Jay needed to hear to stop believing the lies that the scientific community was feeding him as truth, and to see that God is real and God created the heavens and the earth. I'm sharing this with you all so that this goes into your bag of tricks. You don't have to memorize all this stuff, and you don't have to get into the level of detail. But what I do want you to know is that when we use the scientific method and we experiment, there are limits to what it tells us. Nobody was here 1,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, or 1,000,000,000 years ago. So no scientist ever can tell you without a doubt that an object is 1,000,000,000 years old. They can't even tell you without a doubt that it's 1,000 years old. Because while there were people here 1,000 years ago, we weren't. And so when we say that this object is 1,000 years old, there are always a set of assumptions behind the scenes that go into us saying that's how old that object is. And all we got to do to work with people that don't believe that God is real and who are holding on to this for their faith, because make no mistake about it, this is a faith system. They're holding on to this for their faith. All we have to do is take the time to learn how they came up with that answer. And you'll find the assumptions. In the case of radiocarbon dating, the assumption is that we have a clean sample. The assumption is that we can know what the starting point of carbon-14 was. And the assumption is that carbon-14 breaks down at a rate of 50% every 5,700 years. And we can't do anything but assume. There is absolutely no way for us to overcome that assumption, because we weren't here 5,700 years ago when we were putting our meters on things.
Pete, in all of your studying, have you run across scientists who will show you both sides of this coin? They'll show you the 8 billion year curve and also the, are they out there? Because that's what you do.
It's a good question.
Because one thing that you can say is, oh, well, we're not lying. Well, they're not. But they're not telling you other truths as well. And that's what the devil did, kind of.
Usually the true scientists, the ones that are doing all the things like you saw in the video there, will be very quick to document their assumptions. Okay? They will tell you what it is that they're doing in order to overcome this challenge and to deal with this particular thing. The folks that made that video, if you go and you look at their website, they will talk about some of these, they won't talk about the assumptions as much as the challenges and the things that we try to do to overcome those challenges as they're doing it. One of the things they say on their site, I appreciated it because they're being true to their calling as scientists. They end up pointing out that that we have these challenges, and some of them we can't do. They always try to find things that we can do to overcome those challenges. Okay, but one of the things that they pointed out was that there have been so many contaminated samples over the years as people have done radiocarbon dating. It's called radiometric dating, but it's using carbon-14 as the object that it's doing the radiometric dating against. And so that's why they call it radiocarbon dating. But there have been so many folks that have ended up with bad samples, but then they take it and put it out into the scientific community as valid data. And it messes with curves. It messes with everybody else's data because I got this reading and on this object that that we know is 5,000 years old or whatever. And so they even say, be cautious or wary of trusting people that only give you one data point or one sample. It should be repeatable. It should be testable. You should be able to go back and get a second one and come up with the same number in a third sample and come up with the same number in a fourth sample and come up with the same number. And if you really want the scientific community to use that number in these curves, and the calibration curve as well as the half-life curve, there really should be more samples taken. The real scientists, the ones that are doing the hard work of all of this stuff, will be open about the assumptions that they are making and what they're doing to overcome, and the challenges and the things they're trying to do to overcome those challenges. The ones that don't do it are the fifth grade teachers in high school, and the high school teachers. Okay. Because all they're doing is taking this stuff from the scientific community and boiling it down for a fifth grader. And so they say, then the earth is 3 billion years old. It's the people that take the work, the detailed level work that these guys and gals are doing, and then they turn it into a summary statement because that's easier to communicate than to communicate, yeah, we're not really sure because, we're having problems with the calibration of the starting point, and we're having problems determining if that, 5,700 year half-life is really, an accurate curve or not. They don't want to get in. They don't get into all that. They just say this object is this old. But behind the scenes, the ones that are doing the work of the science, many of them will be honest about the assumptions and the challenges. That being said, there are definitely scientists that are in the old Earth, old universe camp. There are scientists that are in the young Earth, young universe camp. And what they will do is they will show you their way of looking at the same data, okay? So most of the Big Bang evolutionists will only show you this curve. If you go to guys like Answers in Genesis, which is excellent organization because they get you thinking about and recognizing these different things, okay? They'll just show you this curve. They'll say that everybody wants you to see this curve, but they'll point you to this curve to show you that the same data, the same reading can point to an Earth that was created 10,000 years ago and matches plain text reading of the biblical account. See, there is a group that kind of engages in conversation with those folks while they are these kind of believers. Okay, they have a website called biologos.org, and you can see some really good conversation there if you like getting into the gory detail, where they won't immediately write off somebody or something because they're saying millions of years and billions of years. They'll engage in conversation and find out, so what are your assumptions and what are the challenges and how did you come up with that number and so forth. And they'll engage in conversation. So Answers in Genesis will kind of fight for a young Earth. Biologos will be kind of in between. And most of the scientific community that feeds into our high schools and our grade schools and natural history museums and things like that, most of that community is, the old Earth curve. And we'll kind of brush over the challenges and the assumptions because what they're trying to do is show that Darwin's theory is true. Can the data roll up into millions or billions of years? Well, yes, it can. And here's how. You put these assumptions into play, and here's how. And unfortunately, that voice is the voice that has been determined in the United States of America as science. And that saying, well, wait a minute, this curve could also be possible, could be true. And it would say that we have a young Earth or that this object is young. That is not being accepted as science, unfortunately, at least in the courts, which means it's not science in the classrooms, even though it's applying logic and reasoning and mathematics and using the exact same data that, all the scientific community is working off of the same bucket of data. These guys go out and they do their experiments and they come back with their numbers, and what we're trying to do is make sense of the numbers.
I think you should make this Sunday's message.
Yeah, and put everybody to sleep. There's a reason we're doing this on a dive deep night. I will tell you that was not only a turning point for Jay, but that was a turning point for me too. When I saw him go down and accept Jesus as his Savior,
I wonder how many of these other scientists
I
just want to be right.
I found myself saying, I want to do that again.
You mean affecting someone
I want to use
live a truthful way.
I want to use the knowledge that I have and the giftedness that God has given me to help somebody else to see God. That story that I just shared about Jay was a turning point for me that started me down the road of ministry and leaving the business world and the scientific world.